Hi, and welcome back. Wave folders are powerful sound design tools. They can easily bring your sounds far beyond the classic analog waveforms, but they also add a lot of possibilities to add complex motion to your patches. Today, we're going to take a deep dive with VastWave from Teia Synthesizers. In this video, I'll go over the functions and features of the module and then dive into a series of more musical patches and ideas for wavefolding. If you'd like to support this video series, or you want to get access to the PDF sheets of the illustrations I use in this and many of my other videos, have a look at my Patreon. As always, you can use the timeline to navigate to specific sections. But now, let's dive right in. The VastWave consists of a single core oscillator on the left and an integrated wavefolder section on the right, with a few special tricks up its sleeve. Starting with the oscillator, there is a mode switch to set the frequency range either to LFO or VCO mode, a large main frequency knob and a small knob for fine-tuning. The oscillator has its own pre-folder outputs at the bottom, offering all the basic analog waveforms as well as an inverted saw. With a jumper on the back, this output can also be set to a double saw. The square wave has a pulse width setting here, as well as a CV input with a bipolar attenuator. There's also an FM input with a built-in VCA, so the amount of frequency modulation can be controlled with this input, for example with an external envelope. There's a 1 volt per octave input and a sync input, switchable between hard and soft sync. And finally, the oscillator has a built-in glide circuit. The speed for that can be set with this knob. The folder section is slightly different from what I'm familiar with. It consists of two sections, a high and a low section. The low section is called Timbre and acts like a classic wave folder, folding the incoming waves onto itself. It has its own input jack right here, which is normal to the oscillator's sine wave when nothing is patched in. The top section, called Symmetry, determines the symmetry of the wavefolder, but also crossfades between two sets of odd and even harmonics waveforms, adding more unique shapes to the mix. The order knob in the middle crossfades between the high and low section. All three parameters have their own CV input with a bipolar attenuator. The output of this entire section can be found here. That output is internally multiplied and routed through a comparator to create an additional pulse output here, resulting into all sorts of interesting pulse waves, which are also affected by the pulse wave settings and CV. Even without a lot of other modules, you can push the sound of this oscillator into all sorts of territories by tweaking the wavefolder by hand. Let's set up a simple voice by taking the final output into a low-pass gate and use a sequencer to tune the oscillator and trigger an envelope opening the gate. With just a single LFO slightly modulating the order, you can create a simple voice with some light movement that can be taken from gentle to harsher by hand. Because the Timbre section has an external input, you can manually patch other waveforms into the folder. I really like the harmonics the folder adds to a saw wave, for example. With some slow modulation to the timbre, it can create lovely organ-style sounds. Instead of slow organic modulation to the wave folder, it's also worth it to experiment with audio rate modulation or even tuned oscillators to create different textures and effects. But I personally like to push wave folders into more complex territory. For example, by adding a lot of modulation to create complex drones or rhythmic tempo synced patches. Let's use the oscillator to create a constant steady drone. To add some moving subtle texture, a somewhat faster LFO to the symmetry works well. Then a slow LFO is modulating the folder, changing the timbre section from gentle to more aggressive waveforms. And finally, a slow random voltage is added to crossfade between the high and low sections, adding organic unpredictable movement to the patch. You can add to this patch by modulating the FM input. This works extremely well because the effect of FM is really influenced by the settings on the folder section, which are already changing all the time. You can take a steady oscillator and send a sine wave to the FM input. Then you can use something like a looping envelope to modulate the internal VCA, creating short bursts of FM. Instead of slow and random changes, you can use a clock and clock divider or pattern sequencer to trigger envelopes or re-trigger LFOs and create tempo-synced rhythmic patterns. Experiment by sending different signals in different amounts to different locations. Again, a second oscillator is used for frequency modulation. If you're more into playing tunes by hand, you can use a similar setup. Use a keyboard or controller to tune the oscillator and use the gate output to gate or trigger some envelopes. For example, use a mixer to send a fast, short envelope to the fold input to add a transient to your sound. You can add a second, more subtle triangle-shaped envelope to create a sort of delay-like sound. Then use a slow rising envelope to the order and the FM amount, and perhaps a slow LFO to the symmetry, and you have a very playable voice. The external input for the timbre section opens up a lot of possibilities. For example, you can mix the waveforms of multiple oscillators before going into the wave folder, or even use the wave folder completely on its own. Adding a second oscillator can add a lot of character to a folded sound. Use a mixer to mix the second oscillator with an output of the VastWave and send the mix to the timbre input. When making drones, you can use a voltage-controlled mixer or VCA to control the amount of second oscillator to the mix. But this trick also works great in simple melodic voice. In that case, make sure to send a 1 volt per octave signal to both oscillators. Wave folders can have a nice effect on a lot of different sounds. For example, a drum bass. Let's use a sample player triggered by a melodic sequencer with an LFO to select different samples. If you set the order knob completely to the timbre section, the folder can be used as a separate function. In this case, folding just the drums. So in this setup, you can still use the oscillator's basic outputs to create a regular independent synth voice, using the same sequencer. pulse output also offers extra possibilities. First off, it creates a lot of interesting raw sounds on its own, but with a little bit of help, you can also use it to create interesting stereo patches. In this patch, a square wave LFO is used to modulate the timbre. The LFO also drives a clock divider, and different divisions are used to modulate the order, symmetry, and pulse width modulation. The pulse output is passed through a low-pass gate. The pulse output is a lot harsher than the sine out, but by sending each to an individual filter and filtering the pulse output a bit more, you can balance that out. The folder parameters influence both sounds simultaneously, so you can easily create stereo drones and voices by adding modulation to the folder or using a sequencer to trigger an envelope and modulate both filters. Taking the same setup as a bass patch, you can experiment with feeding samples to the timbre input to create sort of bit-crushed noises and sounds. You can use the order control to crossfade between the sample and the waveforms of the internal oscillator. Finally, I'd like to highlight two tricks using the LFO mode of the VastWave. By using the wavefolder on basic analog shapes in LFO mode, they basically become looping patterns that can be used to modulate anything. For example, a filter in a simple voice. You can use a clock on the hard sync input to tempo sync the pattern. By slowly modulating the folder or LFO frequency, you create wave morphing variations to the looping pattern. Another trick is to use low-frequency waveforms as the input of a folder, but add another oscillator to fold the LFO into audible tuned shapes. Just add a sequencer, for example, to tune the modulation oscillator, and experiment by having that oscillator modulate different folding parameters at audio rates. In this setup, it's actually the folded LFO you're listening to, and the signal responsible for the slow changes in sound over time. If you'd like to learn more about the modular or sound design, have a look at any of these videos. Also, if you'd like to see more modular content from me, smash that like, subscribe and bell button. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching and see you next time.